Then. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you again. Last week we introduced the Netziv, briefly got into his life story and sort of the arc of his career. We noted that while the legend may say otherwise, in all likelihood, he was quite a prodigious young man, but what is for sure the case is that he's one of the most prolific and certainly one of the most important leaders of Jewry coming out of the 19th century. What I want to do with you this evening is take a much deeper dive into the world that the Netziv came from, the world that produced him. I want to actually go on a journey with you, a journey that took me about 6 years to uncover and articulate, and we will, God willing, do it in under 60 minutes. I noted at the end of our lecture last time that one of the most interesting things to me about Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin is that when you look at the students that he produced, he not only has the Rosh Yeshiva, the leaders of the Yeshivos and the Batei Medrash of the late 19th century and early 20th century listed amongst his students, the most outstanding of the Torah minds of the late 19th century and early 20th century, but you also have the most outstanding Jewish minds outside the world of the Batei Medrash and the Yeshivos, the minds of Jewish academia, the great Yiddish writers, the great Hebrew poets. So many of them studied with Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin in the Volozhiner Yeshiva. And what's more, many of them, most of them, actually leave the world of traditional Judaism, but yet well into their adulthood continue to look back with affection on their time spent studying with Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Now, the truth of the matter is that when I started my own journey into the world of the Netziv, I didn't know anything about Micha Yosef Berdichevsky. I had never heard of him. I had heard of Chaim Nachman Bialik, but I had no idea that he was a student of the Netziv. So none of those were things that I knew then. Here's what I did. I was a young yeshiva student at the time. I had been introduced to the Netziv's Perush on Chumash, like many other young yeshiva students do. And I knew he was the Rosh Yeshiva of the largest yeshiva in the world. I've heard of Volozhin, right? The largest yeshiva in the world, the center of Torah learning, of Lithuanian Torah learning, the aim HaYeshivos. That's what I knew. And I also knew after a while, after I started going through his Perush on Chumash for a few weeks, a few months, that there was something in my mind that was incongruous. There was something that didn't line up between my vision of what a Rosh Yeshiva in Lithuania would say or write and what I was reading in his Perush. There was something that struck me as, dare I say, modern, certainly out of the box, creative, in ways that I certainly didn't expect coming from that world. And there were references to things that I simply didn't think anybody knew about in the little hamlet of Volozhin in the 1850s and 1860s. So let me give you some examples. Second half of the first page, you have several citations from his Perush on Chumash. The first one comes from the story of the flood, the story of Noach. Torah tells us Vayamach and Skali Yakum, and the pasuk continues, Asher al Pnei Ha'adama, that Hashem or the Mabul obliterated anything which existed on the surface of the earth. Says the Netziv as follows: their bodies were completely disintegrated. The Torah says that what was disintegrated were the bodies, the things that were on the face of the earth. But that's specifically to exclude those things that were buried already within or beneath the face of the earth. אבל נשתיירו כמה גופות שנפל עליהם עפר הרבה על ידי שטף המים ונשארו הגופות קיימים. והנה עצמות שמוציאים חופרי ארץ ומוציאים עצמות מבריאות שלא נמצא עתה בעולם. Say it again. Dinosaurs. Dinosaurs in Volozhin in the 1840s and 50s, and you should know archaeology is a rather new science in the 1840s and 1850s. But he writes, right, that the Torah was specifically telling us that the only things that became obliterated were the things above the earth. Anything that was in the earth that stayed whole and intact, and that explains why today people are digging out of the earth these fossils of things that don't exist, of animals that don't exist in our world today. Dinosaurs in archaeology in the work of the Netziv. The next one. He happened to know that the practice in the ancient Near East was that warfare was a spectator sport, and that women would get dressed up in their finery in order to come and watch men at war. Okay, let's keep going. By the way, he says, this practice, this pasuk we have, this prohibition against eating blood. Well, there's a reason. The reason why we're not allowed to eat blood is because in the ancient Near East, they used to eat blood. They used to consume blood as part of a practice of trying to figure out when the rains would come. How do you know that? Still not Gemara. How do you know that? Lo so kifu v'gomer v'lo sashchitz. The next one, v'hagam hayom yishamer b'saros harosh ve'azakan, k'mo she'od hayom minhag b'nei Yishmael kach. Umisha hu isha ma'ala mishamer b'yoser, shelo yiga be'iza saros ha'peyos ve'azakan l'ra'ah. Misha eino b'malai kol kach, eino mishamer arbei. Aval b'kol makom cherpach hu lahasiram l'gamri. This practice of not shaving in certain places in the corners and in your beard. This was the practice, he said, in the ancient Near East. But not only that, it's still the practice amongst the Arab world today. And the Arab world is very far from Volozhin. The Netziv never went to the Arab world. He got on a plane and go to the UAE. And he didn't have the internet. So how did he know not only what was the practice in the ancient Near East, but was still the practice to that day? And he specifies, he says, and the longer your beard was, right, the more of a sign, right, of prominence in society it was. And if it was shorter, you were not so good, right? But how does he know that? The last one. Sritus al-basar shal adam chai. He says the practice in the ancient Near East was that if somebody died, you would cut yourself. You would make an engraving in your arm. And sometimes you would write in the name of the deceased in you as a tattoo on your arm. מי שלא רצה לעשות על בשרו היה סוחר אדם אחר עני לעשות על בשרו ומשלם לו, כמו שעוד היום הנהג שם לזכור מקומנס ומתופפס עליו. Right? And if you had to mourn somebody but didn't actually want to put the tattoo on your own body, you could pay a shlemazel, right, who needed the money, who would cut the name for you into their own body, just like the practice is today, that you can hire somebody who would cry for you, right, who would beat drums for you if you lost a loved one. How does he know? How does he know? And the more I would read, the more these questions came up in my own mind. Right? Where is he getting this from? And I noted last week that it's not like the Netziv is living in Western Europe. It's not like he's Rav Hirsch, who goes to university, or Yaakov Ettlinger, right, who has a degree. He comes to Volozhin at what age? Everybody remember? All right, he actually comes at 13, right? He gets married at 14, and he doesn't leave. And Volozhin is not a very cosmopolitan place. It's a little shtetl in the countryside of Belarus. He doesn't attend university. He has no secular education. How does he know these things? And again, this is just a small fraction of what he knows. You keep reading through his parish and you realize that he is an expert in Hebrew grammar. He knows it really well. He knows and understands Jewish philosophy really well. He understands politics, and I would dare say political science, and we'll talk about a little bit about that next week. We talked about this week already science. He understands, he knows what's happening and being pulled out of the ground. Where does he know? So as I started on my journey after post-Yeshiva, once I got into the world of graduate school, and started to explore this question of, how does he know this? I realized I wasn't the first person to ask this question. We talked a little bit last time about Baruch Halevi Epstein, who is both the nephew and the brother-in-law of the Nitziv. We questioned some of what Baruch Halevi wrote last week. Today, well, we might be up to that again. Baruch Halevi Epstein addresses this question in the memoirs he writes about his father, if you still Baruch Halevi Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan, and his uncle, the Nitziv. And here's what he writes with regard to this question. He records the following story. Once upon a time, says Baruch Halevi Epstein, the maskil, the great master of Hebrew language, Yehoshua Steinberg of Vilna, came, right, and asks my uncle the following. He was this maskilic Vilna, this Vilna maskil was amazed at the Nitziv's prowess in all of these areas. Couldn't understand how he knew these things. And so he says to him, Yorenu Rabbi, may I lo kol hashlamot ha'ila, midukduk hasafa, mishimush halashon, mibikrut b'mikra, misafrut nisgeva ve'areva. Isn't it amazing? It rhymes. He actually asked him a question in rhyme. He says, tell me, Rabbi, where do you get this stuff from? How is it that you know dikduk so well? And you know syntax, and you have Bilkias and all of Tanakh, right? And you know Safrut, you know our literature, probably meaning philosophy. Im anu Vilna im anu rachashnu lanu kinyanim ele ein kol pela bazeh. אחרי שאנחנו הקדשנו להם את מיטב כוחנו ומבחר זמננו ועומק הרגשתנו וכל חושינו ולא ייפלא איפה אם השגנו אותם ונשלוט בהם. ועל זה ברית כרותה יגעת ומצאת. He says, listen, for us, the Maskilim, so surprised that we know these things. We spend all day studying Hebrew grammar, studying Hebrew Jewish philosophy, right? Studying exactly these things. And listen, we know if you spend time studying it, eventually you come to master it. Aval hein Rabbeinu kanodav, natan kol kocho, v'ikdish et kol zmano, v'tzimtzim et kol hageshotav, v'ikbil kol chushav v'kirbo, ach v'rak l'talmud v'sifrato, l'mefarshim l'poskim l'shteilot shivot. He said, but you sit in the base medrash all day. All you do is study Gemara and some poskim and some shutim. How do you know any of these things? If we know it, understood, but you don't study any of this stuff. So how is it that you've possibly come to master it? Now, I didn't give you the answer. I actually spared you a little bit on the source sheets. The answer takes a whole number of additional pages, but he answers with a mashal. He answers with the following parable. And the parable goes as follows. He says there was once a very successful linen merchant who lived in Vilna. And the linen merchant would go from time to time to Moscow. And there in Moscow, there was the great linen textiles. And he would go and he would pick out all the best textiles available. He would pile them into wagons, neatly packed, bring them back to Vilna, and from there he would distribute it throughout the region and sell it at a sizable profit. One day when he was on one of his trips, he stops at an inn along the way, and there's another merchant there who knows him from before, knows he's very successful. This particular merchant, far less so. In fact, he's never really managed to make a very good living. And so he's talking to them about what he's doing, right? And he asks them about the inventory and what it is that he's selling. And he asks him at one point if he could see what it was that he was traveling with. And so he takes him out and shows him these carts filled with these stacks of linens. And each of them is neatly stacked one upon the other, strapped down together with these strong leather straps to make sure they didn't move in transit. And the merchant turns to him and he says to him, these linens are beautiful. I'm noticing the straps. They're really impressive. Where'd you get the straps? He says, what do you mean? Where did you get the straps? No, the straps, I got them from the warehouses with the linens. And what did they cost you? He said. Cost me. He says, no, I buy the linens and they throw in the straps for free. Oh, right. This guy's got the business cup, right? Free straps, right? Now that's a business, right? Who doesn't need some good leather strap? So he decides he's going to go into the strap business. And at his next available time, goes out to Moscow, right? Goes to the very same warehouses that this man had visited before, comes and says, listen, I'd like some straps. Some straps. We sell linens here. He says, yes, but I know, right, that you have straps too. He says, okay, listen, it's a strange request. We've never given anyone straps before, but okay, here are your straps, and here's the bill. Bill, what do you mean? I know you gave the other guy the straps for free. So he said, well, yes, if you would buy the same amount of linen that he bought, we would throw the straps in for free, but you're not buying any linens. You have to pay for the straps. What's the nimshal?
If you learn Torah, then all the extra things come in. The extraneous things are thrown into the straps.
Okay. So you, the masculine of Vilna, you don't learn any Torah, right? All you want is the diktuk and the philosophy and all that. It says, listen, you have to pay for that. You have to work at it. But we, right, the Yoshvei Beis HaMedrash, we sit and learn Torah all day, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu throws the rest in for free. Okay. I happened to see a number of years later that in the Sefer Lulei Sorascha by Rav Shach, so the students of Rav Shach quote the same story, but this time the protagonist is the Gra, not the Netziv. And anytime that happens, right, that the names of the Gedolim are interchangeable, so the questions of whether that in fact is the way it happened become, I think, a little bit more pronounced.
Is it that Hashem throws it in for free, or everything is subsumed in Torah learning and you're looking to get it out of it?
Yeah, we'll go with that. Okay, we can go with that. Either way, I was pretty sure that's not what happened. Right? I was pretty sure that the Netziv probably read and probably worked on these things also, but the question was, could I prove it? Right? What had I gone to I was in the graduate program at this point and gone to my thesis advisors and saying, listen, I found the answer, right? The answer is you studied Gemara all day, right? And they threw the rest in for free. I probably would not have gotten my degree. So my goal was to set out and see if there wasn't another answer, right, that I could potentially submit. And so what I began to do was I began to read through his work. And what I was looking for was any clues, any indications in any of his work that he actually had spent some time studying something outside of the traditional canon, right, of Jewish literature. And if you work your way through his Perush on Chumash, his Hamikdaber, which again is the most commonly studied of his work, you won't find anything. You'll find no reference, maybe one to something which I still haven't quite tracked down yet, but you won't find any reference that you'll recognize to anything outside of the traditional canon of Shas, Poskim, Mefarshei Tanakh, Medrash, right? Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra. Sometimes he'll quote the Gra. Once in a while he quotes his father-in-law, Rav Yitzhak Volozhin. There's nothing else in there. Nothing else. There's plenty of material that makes you wonder where it come from, but no indication as to where it actually came. So next I started working my way through what we said last time was his magnum opus, was his parish on the She'ilto, Sa'amek She'ela. Far harder work, by the way, to get through. And there too, I came up empty. I couldn't find anything in that work either that really suggested in any sort of serious way that he was involved in or reading or studying anything beyond what you would consider to be the traditional Jewish faith. It wasn't until a little bit later that I worked my way backwards in time to the earliest thing that he wrote, but something which wasn't published until the 1950s. So if you remember last time, right, one of the clues we had that it was actually a pretty bright young man was that he was writing a parish on, you remember? The Sifrei, right? The Sifrei on Bamidbar and Dvarim, when he was in his early 20s. He was writing, and it's a 3-volume work, and it's an impressive work. It doesn't get published. He never publishes it in his lifetime. Note that, because we're going to come back. That's going to be an important part of the story. He never publishes it, but it was definitely a product of his youth. Remember, he called it, right, that the work of his B'nai Urim, of his youthful days. And so I started working my way through that text. And lo and behold, all sorts of things appeared. And I've given you just one page of a 3-volume work as an example of what appears just on this one page itself. Now, I mentioned last time also that, when we study these works with our historians' hats on, we're often interested in the very things that you skip over when you're studying them as a Torah learner, which is the Ayin Sham, right, or the Rosh Tevos that we might be quoted. But that's really where we dig in, because that's often where we get our best material. So we're going to look simply at the few underlined lines that you see on page 3, and let's look at what texts the Nitziv is referring to, right, and is citing in these pieces. So in the bottom of the right-hand column, it says V'ayin Kuzari, Ma'amar Bet, Ot Kasbet, Perish Acher al Zeh, V'ayin Sham Be'otzar Nechmad. Okay, so he's referring to what? The Kuzari. The Kuzari is Yehuda Halevi, one of the great works of Jewish philosophy. Now, that may not strike you as strange, but quite honestly, in the world of 19th century yeshivos, not too many people were actually studying Kuzari. But okay, so there's Kuzari, and then it says what? Ayin Sham Be'otzar Nechmad. Everybody know what that is? Really impressed if you did. Okay, good. We'll come back to it. Now look down. We'll start one line above where it's underlined. Ayin harchev hadibur bazeh ha'inyan b'tshuvos Rabaz chelik gimel simin taf mem bet ubehakdamas sefer eshkol hakofer al dikduk ubehakdamas chumash beso v'taf aleph ubeikarim sha'ar gimel Perek Tet Zayin. Now, for those of you who are really excited about the fact that they call somebody a kofar, yeah, don't be. That's not what it means there. But don't worry, we'll get there. All right, flip the page. So these are the works that were just referenced on this one page. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, we know who he is. That Otzar Hanechmad, that he says to see, it's a perush on the Kuzari, written by Israel of Zamoth, who was a Galician mathematician, Talmudist and Maskil, and the teacher of Moses Mendelssohn. The Rabaz, nothing terribly interesting about quoting the Rabaz. Eshkol HaKofer, so yeah, it doesn't mean kofer in the sense of kofer, right? But Eshkol HaKofer is a work of grammar written by somebody who others might call a kofer because he was a Karaite. Now, Karaites were experts in dikduk. Why? Not all Karaites, but many Karaite scholars were proficient in dikduk. Why? Why would that be? Why would they have an interest, a particular interest in diktuk? Because what?
They took everything so literally.
Exactly, right? Because they understood, they only had Torah Shebichtav and not Torah Sheba'al Peh. Understanding the literal reading of Torah Shebichtav was extremely important to the Karaites, and so they authored several works on diktuk, and the Nitziv was reading them. And he specified, right, that this was Eshkol HaKofer al diktuk. Okay, then we have something that we skipped over. It said, you can see it up on the top there, Hakdamas Chumash Beso B'Taf Aleph. All right, we'll come back to that. And then at the end of the Ikarim, Sha'ar Gimel, Perek Tet Zayin. So the Ikarim is also another major work of Jewish philosophy, known as the Sefer Ikarim, written by Rabbi Yosef Al. So we have two works of Jewish philosophy here. We have a work of a Galician maskil, right, and mathematician, the teacher of Moses Mendelssohn. We have a Karaite grammar, and we have this thing called Chumash Beso V'Taf Aleph. Anybody want to take a step with that one? What is he referring to? Well, he doesn't even know. He knows. I mean, he's read that, right? So where does he get them? Okay, it's a good question. We'll come back to it. Remind me. Chumash Beso. Let's start with this. When you see a Chumash with Taf Aleph, what do you generally? What would that suggest? Taf Aleph with regard to a Chumash? Not Tel Aviv. No, it wouldn't be Tel Aviv. Good guess. Not Tel Aviv. So generally speaking, when we have a Chumash with Taf Aleph, it refers to Targum Onkelos, right? Targum Onkelos. Okay, so Chumash Beso, the Targum Onkelos, couldn't make any sense of that. So it took me a little while until I came up with the following possibility. Imagine in your mind's eye for a minute, though, a script, not a perfect script, but a real cursive bet, right? The Hebrew letter bet. Okay, good. Write it out, Lisa. Right? Write that letter bet out. Now, take the bottom of that bet and extend it a little bit further below the line. So we're back up this way, and then it's going to, so like a chaf sofi. Okay, good, right? So it may look like a chaf sofi. Okay, good. When we're looking at Kisvei Yad, right, at handwritten manuscripts, though, very often, again, it depends on where it's from, there's another letter that looks like that, right? Not a cost, right? But if you take that bet and extend the bottom down, very often that's the way a dalet looks. So you're missing kind of the loop, but very often if you're writing fast, that loop doesn't actually appear. So this looks like a dalet. And so that was my working hypothesis. Maybe this is actually a dalet and not a bet. And if it's a dalet and not a bet, now everybody knows exactly what it is, right? No, not the top, the bet. The bet became a dalet. Now it is. Chumash Deso V'Taf Aleph? Oh, very good. Tell us how you got there, please. Okay. Moses Mendelssohn is from Dessau, the Prussian city of Dessau. And now wait, go a step further. What is Taf Aleph? It's not Targum Onkelos. What got Mendelssohn in all of the trouble that he got into with the rabbinic establishment was not his perush on Chumash, but his translation of Chumash into German, which in Hebrew is Ashkenaz. There we go. Right? Chumash, Dessau, Im, Targum, Ashkenaz. That's a reference to the work of Moses.
So he read German?
No, because this was written in Hebrew, right? His
work was German.
The perush was written in Hebrew. The translation was in German. Now there was an easy way to tell whether my hypothesis was right or not, which was simply open up, right? Mendelssohn's Perush of Chumash, right, in the Hakdama, and see, is he referring to what the Nitziv is talking about here? And sure enough, he is. Right? So on this one page, of the Nitziv's Perish on Sifrei, we have references to Yehuda Halevi, to Israel Zamos, to David, even Zimra, to Yehuda Hadassi, to Moses Mendelssohn, and to Rav Yosef Alba. This was a man who was reading rather widely. Turn to page 5. I apologize that I did not keep a copy of this email. But my father did, but he kept it in two pieces, so I had to paste it back together here to put it on the source sheet. I just wanted to take you for a moment into my mindset. This is 2014. I spent 7 years of my life literally engrossed in the work of Rabbi Naftali. He was my life. I went through everything he ever wrote. I spent my time learning about him, writing about him, reading about him, teaching about him. And then all of a sudden in 2014, he sends me an email from the Word. It literally was like earth-shattering, like rattled me. I went to my inbox, right? And there, just look at the bottom, look who signed the email on the bottom. Shavua Tov, u'bracha mikra v'alei, Naftali Yehuda Bar Ilan. Now Bar Ilan is Berlin. That's what it, like, oh my gosh, he's emailing me. Like, how could that be?
I didn't know that.
What? That's true, he did not, you're right. Dinosaurs he knew, but email he didn't know. All right, this is the email that I got. Harav Dr. Perl hayakar lanechbad shalom rav. Hashavat siyamti likot sifracha l'nitziv. עבודתך מקיפה ויסודית מרשימה אותי מאוד. למדתי ממנה רבות מאוד, נהניתי ישר כוחך. So, says this Shabbos, I finished reading your book on the Netziv, and he says it was good work, and he learned a lot. Okay, I'm like nervous here, my heart is like beeping, it's like is pounding, right? And then this next line, Kinino shel haNetziv, ben achar ben, ani marshil liatzmi lichtov kama hashlamot. He says, listen, as a descendant of the Netziv, father after son, a direct descendant of the Netziv, I took the opportunity, gave myself permission to fill in a few things or to make a few comments on your work. I'm like, oh man, I'm finished. Aleph. חלק גדול מהספרים שהיו ברשותו של הנציב עבר לידי סבי המנוח, הרב מאיר בר אילן, ביניהם היה גם הביאור של מנדלסון. עובדה זו מחזקת טענתך שנציב עיין בה. Well, it says, listen, my grandfather got many of his has many of his sfarim, right? And I've seen them, and amongst them was Mendelssohn's Perish on the Chumash. So check for you on that one. Okay, and the next one, by the way, he writes, Gam Ladati, Eina Makor, right? Eina Makor Baruch. That was last week's lecture. He also agrees that the Makor Baruch was not right when he said the Netziv was not a very prodigious young man, and he was actually a pretty bright young man also. Anyway, it was amazing. He's very complimentary in this. It was an incredible thing to see. You can read the rest of it for yourself, but what we have established without a shadow of a doubt at this point is that the Netziv was indeed reading pretty widely, including the works of Mendelssohn. But here's the fascinating thing. Mendelssohn is the least. Well, no, that's not true. That is an overstatement. Not the least, but Mendelssohn is not the most radical of the authors that I found cited in the Netziv's work, in his Perish, right? But not just that it wasn't just cited. The Netziv cites Azariah de Rossi, a far less of a household name, but doesn't just cite him, cites him over and over again, cites him at his most radical, right? And was highly influenced by him without question of a doubt. Who was Azariah de Rossi? Well, Azariah de Rossi was a 16th century Italian Jewish Renaissance writer. Azariah de Rossi writes a work called Meor Einayin, in which he applies many of kind of the methodologies of the Renaissance to the world of Jewish learning. And he is the first one. Well, not really. Sadu Gaon was really the first one, but he's the first one in sort of the early modern period. They come out and say, when Chazal writes about science, the using of science every day, it doesn't necessarily need to be followed today. And when the Chazal were writing about history, they were based on the histories that they had at their disposal. And sometimes they actually didn't intend to be taken literally. And sometimes Chazal writes with metaphors, and sometimes they exaggerate in order to make a point. They take literary license, and that's okay. That's how Chazal wrote, and we don't have to take everything they write in the world of Agadah literally, because it wasn't intended that way. Well, as you can imagine, Asari Darasi was not beloved by many of his rabbinic colleagues at the time. It is said that the Mechaber, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo, actually wrote a writ of excommunication, cherem, against Azariah Darasi and his works. What is absolutely true is that the Maharal of Prague spends pages upon pages excoriating this work. I mean, in no uncertain terms, that this book should not be read, right, by anybody in the Jewish world. That his work is kfira through and through. Now, the Netziv not only cites it, but he specifically cites, right, the areas that specifically talk about the approach to Chazal. So let's look at some of them. Right? So on the top, on page 6, you have in the brackets, and by the way, I've seen the manuscript, and the brackets are the Netziv's own writing. So that's not somebody adding it in later, in case you were worried about that. But in the first source on page 6, Ayin b'ma'or einayim chelek dalet perek tes ma'arich bazeh. It tells you where to look, right? And so, as you'll see on the next page, I went and I looked. Right? Let's look at the next one. The second source on the top of page 6. The Sifrei there, you can see that they're in the bolded writing. She'eretz Yisrael gavoha mikol ha'aratzo. Right? This is a medrash. The medrash says that the land of Israel is higher than all other lands. Now, what's the problem with that? Right, it's not. Right? Okay. Not only is it not, but actually Israel is home to the lowest place, right, on earth. Okay, good. Right? So ayin ma'orei naim la'adomi imrei bina perek yalef shehochiach she'al harov yomru o al haratos harishumos v'haruyos nishtabeach ayin sham. Says go look at the writing of Azariah Darasi, and he writes, it doesn't mean it's higher than all countries. It's higher than most countries, says Azariah Darasi. I mean, we're exaggerating a little, but al harov nemru. Or he says, actually, it wasn't intended to be literal at all. Rather, that it's higher than other lands means that it's spiritually higher, right? It's on a different level. It's more praiseworthy than others. It's exactly this issue of whether we take Chazal literally or not that the Netziv is citing the work of Azariah Darasi. Look at the next one. Third, on 3 lines. Sorry, let's start on the second line. You can see that the Sifrei refers to a place called Kartigni. And so the Netziv writes, he Kartaga hamefursemes b'Yosifon shekivshash ameshifia gibor romi v'ayin b'sefer me'orei naim la'adomi imrei bina perek yud aleph v'timtza mikoma b'Africa. And if you want to know where this place is, go look in Me'orei naim, and he'll tell you he's identified where this place Kartigni is in Africa. Okay, go down the bottom of the page. That's Me'orei naim. It's actually available in English translation. And he does, in fact, identify where this Kartigni is. How did he know what Kartigni was? Who told him? Well, who told Darasi? Look at yes, a Christian translator named Saint Jerome. Yeah, Saint Jerome. Okay, so let's put that together, right? Azariah Darasi is reading Saint Jerome in order to identify Carthage as the place, and then the Netziv is saying, yeah, go read Darasi, and you'll see that it cites the Christian translator, St. Jerome, who tells you where this is in Africa.
This is why they're not, they don't want anyone else reading it.
Oh, okay. Okay. Why? Who didn't want anybody reading?
I don't want to say. The Maharal, first of all.
Okay.
And people who don't want a big Adam box.
Okay. Okay. This was one of many, right? One of many of many examples, and I have more for you on page 7. Those other passages are just simply the passages, not just as it's cited, but he says, Ayin Sham, go read it. That's what it means. Ayin Sham, go look there. So I did, right? I followed his instructions. I looked there, and that's what I have for you here. It's literally, he's pointing to the passages that were most problematic, right, to the rabbinic establishment at the time. To give you some sense as to the continued legacy of Derasi down to this day, on page 8, you have the letter of Cherem that was written, the excommunication that was written, that Rabbi Nathan Slifkin's books. If you all, I see some giggles, so people remember, right, that a number of years ago, Nathan Slifkin wrote, what was his book about? Yeah, okay, good, right? Science and Chazal, science and Torah. And so one of the things Nathan Slifkin had to navigate in his book was, well, how much do we depend on Chazal for their science, and how much is it okay, right, to veer from what Chazal say when it comes to these specific areas? Well, this was Moshe Shapiro's letter of Cherem against this work. Let's you can see it on the second line. He calls it Ksira Gemura Be'amisa Shel Torah. Right? Look at the next bolded line. The Svarim Elu Sifrei Minim Hey. These works, the works of Slifkin, are the works of apostates. Kemoshe Kasuv Rabbeinu Hamaral Al Sefer Meor Einayim Sheyatsa B'Daro. Right? It's exactly the same as the issues that the Maharal was writing about with regard to the Sefer Meor Einayim of Azariah Derasi. Right? And again, Bidvarav Be'er Hashishi Sefer Be'er HaGolah, and now he's quoting, and he's quoting from the works of the Maharal. Arur Yihyeh Hayom Asher Bo Niglu V'Nirim Devarim Elu. Ish Asher Lo Yadala Havin Divrei Chachamim Af Davar Echad Midvrei Maktanim V'Chulei. Eich Lo Yira L'Daber B'Chachamim V'Daber Aleim Ki'ilu Hem Anashim B'Daro V'Chaverav V'Chulei. Yoser Mizeh Kinadnu B'Dvarav V'Chulei Asher Hem Ru'yim L'Hitzaref Kamo Sifrei Minim V'Hem Yoter Gruim Meham V'Asnu B'Tfus Ki'ilu Hayum Sifrei Kodesh. And on it. The heresy of Slifkin is the heresy of Azariah Derasi, right? That the Maharal already spent pages elaborating, and yet there it is in the work of the Nitziv. He's reading it, he's writing about it, and he's telling his readers to go look there and read for themselves. So you can imagine my excitement. And after having discovered this in his Perush on the Sifrei, and I come to my thesis advisor and say, you'll never believe what I found. The Nitziv was reading all sorts of things under his Gemara. He had a Mendelssohn under there. He had some Karaite grammars under there. Right? He had some Jewish philosophy, and you'll never believe this, he had a Zaria Duros tucked away under his Bava Kama. Well, let me tell you what my thesis advisor said. My thesis advisor is currently the undergraduate dean of Harvard College. His name is Jay Harris. Here was his response. His response, and I credit him completely. He said to me, how do you know it was under the Gemara? Excellent question, right? An excellent question. I was projecting my own contemporary view of what must have happened, because today, if you're going to read Azariah Derasi or Mendelssohn, right, in the base medrash of Pelzer or Mir, you better make sure it's under the Gemara, right? But maybe it wasn't the case. Maybe it was on top of the Gemara, or in other words, what he meant was, how do you know he was that way? Was he that? Maybe he wasn't a closet mask. Maybe this is just what people were doing. Maybe it's just what people were reading. How do you know there was anything particularly scandalous about reading any of these things. And so he sent me back and he said, go find out, go figure out whether anybody else was doing the same thing.
Weren't some of the students of the Gaon also involved in these things? And maybe to back up what Jay Harris is telling you, maybe he's just the zeitgeist of the students of the Gaon.
Let's look on page 6. These are the drushos of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Edel, who is the Maggid of Slonim. A quick note about Maggidim. Right? Sometimes we hear about Maggidim. I think we have a different, slightly warped perception of what a Maggid was in Eastern Europe. A Maggid was not a storyteller. A Maggid was the public intellectual. A Maggid is the person who would give a drasha on Shabbos afternoon. In the big cities, there was a permanent position of Maggid. The position of Maggid always had with it a seat on the Beis Din. Right, so you had to be a first-grade Talmid Chacham to be a Maggid. The community rabbi did not speak. The community rabbi spoke two Shabbosim a year, right? Before Pesach, before Rosh Hashanah. They didn't speak. That wasn't their job. Right? The Maggid's job was to speak. And if you were in a small town, you didn't have your own Maggid, so there were itinerant Maggidim. There were traveling Maggidim. They would come to town. There'd be a class, after shul, they would say so and so. They always spoke in the afternoon, right? So when Maggid is here to speak, right, he'll be giving us shir, right, later between Mincha. So Rabbi Yehuda Leib Edel was the Maggid of Slonim. He was Slonim's public intellectual, and these are a collection of his shuvos. Now you can see, right, his years line up where he was influenced by the Vilna Gaon. He wasn't a student of the Vilna Gaon, right? But the Vilna Gaon dies, I think, in 1797. Right, so he still very much belongs to that world, and you can see in the underlined line there, right, the Ayin Hakdamas Sefer Meor Einayim Kasav Talmai Philadelphia Hayash Lishi B'Malchus Mokdon. All right, if you want to know who Talmai Philadelphia is, right, of the Macedonian ruler, says the Maggid of Slonim, go read a Zayid Arasi, right? He'll tell you, right? Okay, turn the page. This is the son of the Vilna Gaon, Rav Avraham ben Eliyahu. He writes, Ubal Ma'orinayim Asaf Malay Haroim Molim V'Arelim. And then he goes on to talk about what you will find there. He says, the Baal HaMa'orinayim, he's what does it mean? Asaf Malay Haroim Molim V'Arelim. He gathered together the great shepherds, or our great teachers, both those who were Mulim V'Arelim, those who were both Jewish and non-Jewish. Anybody know what non-Jew is referred to in Zayid Arasi? Very good. Saint Jerome, that's one, right? So he's calling out the fact that not only did he read Zayid Arasi, but he knows that what found in Zayid Arasi are both, right, comes from within our tradition and from outside of the Jewish tradition. Turn the page. This comes from your standard Vilna edition of the Medrash Rabbah. Most of the commentaries around the text in the Vilna Medrash Rabbah were part of this world, the world that Netziv came from. That is the early 19th century Lithuania. And the author that we're going to look at right now, Radal, actually had a personal relationship with Netziv. We have this correspondence back and forth between the two. Netziv saw him as a mentor. His name was Rav David Luria. He was the rabbi of Olbichov, considered to be one of the great gedolim of the time. In fact, I think I mentioned last time that soon after the Netziv takes the leadership of Volozhin, his leadership was called into question. The students start to fight as to whether he should be the Rosh Yeshiva or if Yosef Soloveitchik should be the Rosh Yeshiva, and they call in a panel of three of the most respected Talmidei Chacham in Lita to settle the dispute. Rav David Luria was one of them. Okay? So considered to be one of the great gedolim of the time, writes Rav David Luria in his Perush, which you can access in any Vilna Shas. Any Vilna Medrash Rabbah, he says as follows: the Medrash refers to the Kape Barabria, and it says Rav David Luria, Ze Hayam Shebema'arav Eretz Yisrael Hanikra B'Torah Hayam Hagadol. This refers to that to the body of water, right, in the west of Israel that we call Yam Hagadol, or L'shonenu Hayam HaTichon. We call it what? The Mediterranean. V'chol mekomos shehuzkaru kan al Hayam Hazeh. והנה ראיתי שכתבו חכמי הטבע דבר נפלא שבמקום שים זה מתאחד עם ים אוקיינוס שהוא מיצר ג'יברלטר ששם קלפי ברבריה כמדומה שאין נקראים היום בשם עמודי אורקוס, ניכר חריפתא דמאיה שהמים הולכים מאוקיינוס לתוך ים זה במשך כמה מילים. Says the Rav David Luria of Bechov, I saw something amazing in the scientists, in the writing of the scientists. They write something about the salinity of the water by Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean Sea hits the Atlantic Ocean. Really? Like, he didn't have Wikipedia. Like, where did he, what? Who is he reading? Right? He read it himself. I read this, right? He's reading scientific literature of some sort as the rabbi of old Bichel, right? in the early 19th century. Let's keep going. He is the Maggid of Navardik. Now, why do these things show up in the works of the Maggidim? Because the Maggidim needed Chomer for the drushos, right? They would talk and they needed interesting stuff, so they would read. They would read widely, right? So that they had what to talk about and they would cite what they were reading. Says the Maggid of Navardik in the box that you have there. We'll start at the end. The Ein Leharich, the Harotzel La'amod al Omek Ha'inyan, the Ayin, the Sefer Igros HaPhilosophim, LaHachacham HaShalem, Morenu Harav, Moshe Ben Mendelssohn, Belashon Ashkenaz, the Michtav Harishon, the Hasheni, Atam Kasafti, so on and so forth. Well, if that isn't explicit enough, right? Says the Maggid of Navardik, if you want to know more about this, read the German philosophical writings of Harav Hagon, right? Morenu Harav Moses Mendelssohn. Navardik, the first half of the 19th century. These were not maskilim. These were not closeted anything. These were the public intellectuals of Jewish life at the time. Yoel Dober HaKohen Persky writes Perushim HaMedrash. He's also a translator. He translates Aesop's fables into Hebrew, right? Living in Volozhin in the first half of the 19th century. Page 15 is the Maggid of Vilna, an amazing little piece on the Afilu Kulanu Chachamim Kulanu Devonim, and you'll see the respect he has for secular writing and secular study. So, I come to the conclusion that, in fact, the hunch that my thesis advisor had was right. Probably wasn't under the Gemara, because the world he's coming from is a world where everyone seems to be reading. Now, how did he know? That was the question before. Well, he knows because others are reading it, right? And he's reading their work, but it's more than that. What I was able to trace is that you actually have in the late 18th and early 19th century an absolute boom in the printing industry, the Hebrew printing industry in Eastern Europe. So books just become available. The technology is there to produce them, and they become available in ways that they've never been before. And if you're a publisher of books, right, and you make your living that way, so you're constantly looking for new things to publish. Right? You don't want to, how many Chumash Brashis can you publish? Right? And so you start publishing and start widening the scope of what you publish. Right? And actually, the way these things were generally done is you pre-subscribe to the work. So you'd find out whether people are interested in reading them, and if they are, you'd publish them and you'd put them and you'd give them a copy. So there's this boom in publishing in the first half of the 19th century. And so these books become available. But the bigger question is, what happens? Where does it go? What happens in the second half of the 19th century? Why is it that in the Perush on Chumash, you find none of this? There are no references to any of these authors. He's writing all about them in his work on the Sifrei, and it's not there at all in the Perush on Chumash, when clearly he read them. So why isn't it there? And the answer to that question has to do with the history of 19th century Eastern Europe, which goes a little bit beyond what we can do here tonight, but suffice it to say as follows. What's known as Haskalah, as the movement for Jewish enlightenment. It has its roots in the first half of the 19th century, but it doesn't really become a force in the world of 19th century society until the second half of the 19th century. It isn't until then, right, that you actually have intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, who are openly saying, like Rabbi Yehuda, like Yehuda Leib Gordon did, be a Jew at home and a man on the streets. Right, where reading these kinds of books was associated with leaving a world of traditional observance. Where reading these kinds of things meant that you were going to espouse ideas that were antithetical to Torah and Torah life. Those things they were not associated with one another in the first half of the 19th century. In the first half of the 19th century, a book was a book, and you read it, and if it was helpful for what you were trying to say or trying to learn, you used it. If it wasn't, you discarded it. But it didn't come with, there were no other associations with it. It wasn't dangerous in the way that it became in the second half of the 19th century, because these scholars, right, began to see young men who were reading these things, and as a result, beginning to leave the fold. What's more so is that the position of the Nitziv changes. He's writing this parish on the Sifrei. He's a Youngelite. He's learning in Kailo. And he's in his early 20s. He has no responsibilities in the world. So he says, sure, Ayin Sham, go read it. I read it. You'll enjoy it too. In the second half of the 19th century, what is he? He's the Rosh Yeshiva. He's the Rosh Yeshiva. And it means something else to go tell your students, yeah, go read the Rossi, right? Go read it. Go read it. A Karen Rabbi. And so I believe that's the reason why he didn't publish his parish on the Sifrei. And again, it was never published until the 1950s, when his descendants published it. And in fact, I'll show you, and with this we'll end. Huh? Oh, they did. They did. I'm not so convinced that Chumash Beso, right? I think they know that it was Chumash Desau, and I think it came out as Beso. And there are a few other places that there are actually words missing in the printed text. And I did see briefly his manuscript on the work, and some of these citations are actually underlined in the manuscript in pink, meaning they were aware of them, right? And I think some of them, at least, they tried to keep out. But speaking of redaction, one more source, and with this we'll end. Zundel, the Maggid of Navardik, remember that one?
Yes.
Yep, that's page 12, right? The Maggid of Navardik. What you have on page 12, that's the first edition of his Perush on Perek Shira, in which he writes, and let's look at the words again, V'ein laharich, v'harotzel la'amod al omek ha'inyan, ayin b'sefer igros ha'filosofim l'chacham ha'shlem arenu harav Moshe ben Maimon, v'lashon Ashkenaz v'if tavarishon v'hasheni, and then it continues, u'lezeh ha'ta'am. This piece was published, this was the first edition, published in the 1840s. Go to the last page. This is published only in 1859, but in Pressburg, which is already far more in the heat of the world of enlightenment and the world of reform. Well, this is the next edition of it, and it says, "Ve'ein laharis, v'zeh hatam katavti." God is any reference to Moses Mendelssohn, to its writing, it lifted from the text, never again to return. So I believe what we've seen, I hope what we've seen, is that in fact the Nitziv comes from a world that is actually fascinatingly open, right? A world, the first half of the 19th century, where your leadership, your Jewish leadership, was reading widely and sharing what they read, really without much care for any associations, or perhaps without any associations made to those particular texts. Come the second half of the 19th century, and the world of Lithuanian learning begins to circle the wagons. Right? It becomes dangerous to read these texts, and let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They didn't see they couldn't see, right? That Judaism would survive a world in which people could learn both and actually still continue to be observant and continue to be in the religious world. And so this begins to be weeded out. And at the same time, you have a rise of the great yeshivos, which focus their curriculum on the learning of Gemara, right, and particular yeshivos and mesechtos, rather than the wide world of medrash, right, that you had seen in the early 19th century. And as a result, much of this gets lost, but not all of it. And this was a point that you think you made last time. There are some people who will make it out of this world, the world of Lita, who still have a pretty broad sense, right? Who appreciate, right, broader texts, broader learning, who bring this world of view, right, that sometimes seems surprising to us, but now we know it's actually rooted a generation or two generations before in the world of Lithuania. One of them would be the great student of the Netziv, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen, a man who was extremely broad in all sorts of ways, a man who was known probably best for his positions on tolerance of Jews inside the religious camp and outside the religious camp. And so next week, we are going to see whether we can in fact trace that idea back to his teacher, the Netziv, which comes back to the world of early 19th century. Thank you.
The reason why last week when you mentioned that his school was not so brilliant, that was their way of saying like, wasn't Jewish, so not.
Rabbi, I'll ask you for a source sheet tomorrow morning, if I may, please.